Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And this is the third of our 4-episode series on the Paris Commune, the short-lived radical revolutionary government that controlled the French capital for 72 dramatic and violent days in the spring of 1871. Now, we ended the last episode with an attempt by the forces of the official French government, by then based in the Palace of Versailles on the outskirts of Paris, to seize control of the cannon that had been assembled high up above the city at Montmartre. That attempt had brought about a popular rising amongst working-class men and women in what was then a poor district of Paris, and that uprising was the beginning of what became the Commune.
So now Paris is in the hands of insurgents. The city's running itself, or trying to figure out how to run itself. Red flags are flying and everyone is arguing about what comes next. There is this kind of brief heady moment, and we'll talk about this through the rest of the story, where it actually feels possible that a new republic might be built, from the streets up. And they kind of come together for a minute, but Paris, being Paris, unity is not going to last very long. And of course, the arguments start almost immediately, partly because they don't have a leader. Who's in charge? What's the plan? Who's speaking for the people? Which people? As we said, by no means is all of Paris united behind the radical left. The bourgeoisie are watching in horror as the radicals take over the government. And while all of them are arguing, Versailles is regrouping.
The official government, the national government.
The national government is not just sitting watching while Paris does this. They are figuring out their next move. And Thiers, who is the head of the assembly, has absolutely no intention of leaving Paris in the hands of radicals. So the morning after the Montmartre uprising, so on March 19th, 1871, the National Guard's Central Committee moves into the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. And they call for elections for a new government, because they need to have some legitimacy and they don't want to be accused of having a coup. But the city continues to split. It's dividing along the lines we talked about last time, where there are moderates who want the city to restore order and radicals who want to finish what they've been trying to finish since 1789. So one of the reasons why there's no one in charge is that the movement's natural leader, Auguste Blanqui, is in prison again. Now, listeners will remember we met him in episode 1, and he's the man that de Tocqueville described as looking as if he were moldering from the grave and had just escaped from a sewer. So he's the arch conspirator. And he would have been the person that they all look to. But on March 17th, so the day before the government tries to seize the cannon on Montmartre, Blanqui was arrested in the south of France. And he had gone there to drum up support for their movement. And he's thrown in jail. So he can't lead the commune because he's languishing in a cell in Figeac. But he will still play a crucial role in how the commune unfolds. So the fact that he's sitting in prison in the south of France matters. Now, a lot of historians take the position, and here they agree with Blanqui's own followers, that if he had been free, the commune might have had a different outcome because it would have had a leader. Instead, the commune is chaotic, it's fractious, it's making it up as it goes. And it can't last long in that state. But for a few weeks, the city turns itself into a kind of political workshop, right? And it's led by this coalition that we talked about in the first episode, that this kind of unlikely coalition of students and soldiers and artisans and workers and teachers and writers and painters and a handful of foreign radicals who love a good revolution, and they've come as well. And all of these people together are trying to invent something on the fly. And remember that they're still basically under siege. They've got food now. So Bismarck has allowed supplies to come back in. People are eating again. They can look after themselves, but the city is still surrounded. And that, of course, affects how it plays out as well. Some of the members of the commune are forgotten to history, but not everyone by any means. And among the more famous communards is Gustave Courbet, who at this time is France's most famous painter. He's also a born provocateur. That's who he is. He's known as the master of realism, and he's famous because he's the first great painter in France to take ordinary life and to turn it into epic art.
So he's not painting scenes from classical mythology. He's painting scenes of France as it is at that point in the middle of the 19th century.
But he's using the techniques that had previously been reserved for Exactly, for mythology, for religion, for great leaders, for royalty. And he's using those techniques to depict stonecutters and peasants, all on the heroic scale that's usually reserved for these supposedly grand subjects. And he uses them for ordinary working class subjects. And by 1871, that has made him a celebrity and a celebrity leftist. His politics very much match his painting. So for him, the Commune is a chance to democratize art in the way that the revolution is, he hopes, democratizing politics. And there are other painters at the time who sympathize. So Pissarro, Renoir, the famous Impressionists who are not yet famous, they're about to become famous, but they are there and they're very sympathetic with what the Commune is up to. And Courbet helps found what he calls the Federation of Artists, which is a kind of artistic commune, basically to take it away from the old establishment politics of the salon. And in Britain, of course, it's the Academy, where a few elites decide what constitutes great art and what doesn't. And he's arguing that if the Parisians can run a city, then they can run their own galleries and museums too.
They don't need the government to tell them what's good painting and what's bad painting.
Yeah. One of the things that Courbet does, which is one of the kind of iconic moments of the Commune, is that he proposes pulling down the Vendôme column, which is Napoleon's giant bronze monument to victory at Austerlitz.
This is one of Napoleon's great victories.
And radicals have hated this monument for years. They see it as, not unreasonably, they see it as a monument to war, of course, but also to Napoleon's ego. And for a few weeks, they sort of argue about it. And then the Commune agrees and orders that the column should be demolished as a symbol of imperialism and chauvinism. And it is both of those things. That seems fair enough. So a few weeks later in the spring, it comes down before, a crowd that's roaring with approval. It is, as I say, a kind of iconic moment in the Commune, but it's also a familiar moment, I think, to listeners today. I mean, tearing down statues in a fight over which parts of your history you're willing to celebrate sounds kind of familiar.
And it is, of course, still there because it was later rebuilt. So it was a temporary removal. And it is, I have to say, I think it is rather beautiful. It had a statue of Napoleon at the top of it at that point.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of a statue, but also a monument. And I guess the problem that they have is that it is a memorial to a victory in which lots of ordinary French people took part, but also a statue to Napoleon. So it's both a monument and a statue.
Yeah. And critics at the time even are pointing out that maybe this shouldn't have been a priority.
Yeah.
That maybe taking down a statue when you've literally got the enemy at the gate and the government is regrouping and going to come for you, maybe you need to be thinking about practical matters rather than these symbolic gestures. As we said, the Central Committee decides that it needs to gain some legitimacy, and so it calls elections very quickly, which are announced on March 22nd. They're held just 4 days later. They were open only to men, and they were, trying to turn the street rebellion into a legitimate government. And it returns a kind of mixed council of socialists, radicals, Republicans. They all have, quite different agendas. They are united in their sense that they don't want to be led by the national government, but they're divided on basically everything else. And of course, the bourgeoisie and the elite are appalled at the radicals taking over the city and occupying the Hôtel de Ville. Well, they're not occupying anymore. They've had an election, and now they're there. Once they're in charge, installed at the Hôtel de Ville on March 28th, they do get straight to work. They have these actually quite simple aims in one sense. They have these ideals. They know what their principles are, and they want to turn them into institutions. They want to show that ordinary people can govern the city. And they start making decrees. They just start issuing executive orders, to use the language of today. And some of them sound really familiar for a reason, because this is the moment when these practices are established. So they separate church and state, an incredibly important change. They basically lay the groundwork for the secular state of France that we know today. They mandate rent relief, because, of course, along with the skyrocketing prices of food and everything else during the siege, of course, rent has been going up as well. They create pensions for soldiers' families, and they're very focused on education. They want education to be free, compulsory, secular, so they get the church out of the classroom, no more priests running education, and it is coeducational. It's for both sexes. So that's an incredibly important foundation of their policy, and they take state funding away from the churches. So crucifixes come down from public buildings. It's a clean break with the old monarchical clerical order. It's trying to rebuild itself as a republic of citizens rather than subjects. They also have an economic platform. They cap salaries so that they want to try to narrow the gap between the workers and the wealthy. They give abandoned workshops to cooperatives. They back women's workshops to help them earn their own living. And one of my favorite details of the Commune, they reset the clocks to decimal time. So it's this lovely throwback to the revolution. But what's funny about it is that basically nobody knows how to read it anymore. So they decide that they're going to bring back decimal time, but decimal time is incredibly complicated. So as the name decimal suggests, what they did was they divide each week into 10 days rather than 7. And then every day is split into 10 hours. And every hour is split into 100 minutes. And so on and so on. And then each minute has 100 seconds and it keeps going. And so basically nobody knows what time it is sort of the end result of it. But I love that they decide that they're going to have the neo-Jacobins have their decimal time brought back. But it's not the decimal time that gets everybody worked up. The thing that gets everybody worked up is the ban on night baking.
Yeah, it's a very specific thing that they choose to do. It seems very small and strange to us today.
It causes absolute mayhem. It's a simple idea. It's a humane labor reform. They want to keep bakers from working themselves into the ground. Bakers have been kind of clamoring it for a long time. They want to not have to stay up all night baking. And so they pass this ban on night baking so that bakers can, not work themselves into the ground. But in practice, it means that Parisians woke up one morning to find that there were no fresh croissants. So you can imagine the mayhem that ensues. Absolute disaster. Clearly, the true crisis of 1871, if you're a Parisian, is there after famine and starvation and humiliation and Germans in Versailles and down the Champs-Élysées, and now there are no croissants.
And as you're saying that lots of these changes, we now, as you're reading them out, they just sound like things that define modern France. Workers' rights, the separation of the church and the state, the keeping of church out of education. These are things that the French today regard as being typically quintessentially French, and this is their first iteration.
Yeah, this is the birth of those principles, or putting those principles into practice.
So many of the things that the Commune brings in are now uncontroversial parts of French life.
Yeah. And that's part, of course, why the Commune is so important, right? So it isn't just a blip in French history. It is laying the groundwork for changes. It's just that it can't achieve everything it wants to achieve in 72 days. But eventually, a lot of what it wants to do is put into practice. And these are serious reforms, as you're saying. This is social democracy, and it's being built from scratch under siege. There are a few other reforms that are worth mentioning. They give women, widows, pensions, regardless of whether they were legally married or not. Now, you can imagine how the church responds to that. And not just the church, but conservatives are not very happy about that. So there's some genuinely radical transformations to women's rights. They also say that the state will treat all children the same, regardless of whether they're legitimate or not. Another radical transformation. And again, this is, of course, shocks the clergy and other conservatives. And they say that there should be equal pay for equal work for women, starting with teachers and nurses. These are all really modern values. I mean, they are very much ahead of their time. But what really makes the Paris Commune unprecedented isn't just these values. It's the ways in which they were put into practice. Because it's the first revolutionary government that is openly controlled by the working class. It's not controlled by professional politicians or the intellectuals or the theorists of the movement. It's controlled by the working class people themselves. And so many historians call it the first true experiments in proletarian self-government.
Yeah, the experiment is really, is a key word here. They don't have long enough. They're trying to reimagine what it is to build a government in a moment of military crisis and invasion, and they are trying to invent it as they go.
And it's collective action, right? Their principle is about collectivism. Power runs from the bottom up. So delegates are elected. They are supposed to be paid workers' wages. They made a lot of noise about this, that delegates would not be paid any more than anybody else. In practice, they actually were paid more than workers, but supposedly they were paid the same as workers. And they could be recalled at any moment. There's no president. There's no mayor. There's no single leader. There's no commander. All decisions are made in committees and councils. Now, You and I both work in universities, David, at least some of the time, and we both have spent a lot of time on committees. In my experience, very few decisions are ever made by committees. It's not even whether they can make good decisions. They can't make decisions at all.
Yeah.
It's a disaster waiting to happen to think that you can run a country entirely by committees and councils.
And it's almost a cliche now of workers' cooperatives or committees or socialist governments being unable to come to decisions because there are so many opinions, so many people involved. But in some ways, these cliches are being born here. This is an experiment in the truest sense because no one's done this before.
Yeah. And this is, as you say, it becomes a cliche and it's a kind of running joke. I mean, you think about all the gags in the life of Brian and Monty Python about how the left can't come to decisions. But as you say, this is, in a sense, what they're part of what they're mocking is.
This is the birth of the People's Front of Judea, or the Judean
People's Front. I think you'll find, precisely that.
Yeah.
So they've deliberately decentralized to keep power from concentrating at the top. But that also makes, as we're saying, decisions incredibly difficult.
They're also trying to run a militia, an army to defend themselves at the same time with the similar principles.
With the same principles. So they democratize the military. So they abolish conscription, so it's all voluntary. They turn the army into a citizen militia that's open to all able-bodied men. And so, the aim here sounds admirable. Make sure the people who fight for the commune are also the people who are leading the commune. So there's no distance between rulers and ruled. It's a lovely utopian aim. But in the army, it means that discipline immediately breaks down. Right? Military commanders can be voted out by their own troops if they don't like their orders. How is that going to work in a
we're going to see
situation?
Similar things happen in the Russian Revolution. We're going to see similar things in the Spanish Civil War. It's all wonderfully idealistic, but troubled.
And as soon as decisions have to be made, you are in a world of pain. And meanwhile, ordinary Parisians who are not caught up in the politics one way and another are departing the city en masse. Some observers reported an exodus as high as 50,000 people a day. So they're just fleeing the city. They can just see what's on the horizon. And
it is a tragedy to say that they're not wrong to realize early on that this form of government, with all of its idealism, despite the laws that have been passed that would benefit the lives of many Parisians, that this could easily end in disaster. It is those with money, those with options who tend to leave. So Paris is being emptied of its middle class, and this experimental radical government is pushing further and further down this path. Let's discover what happens after a quick break. Welcome back. We are in the midst of the Paris Commune. Already this radical new system of government is beginning to fracture.
Yeah, there's a kind of brief burst of unity, but it doesn't last very long. The Commune is a heterogeneous, disordered mix, as we've said. They've got different ideologies, different agendas. And without a leader like Auguste Blanqui, who is in prison in Figeac, it just descends into chaos. But importantly, what it doesn't descend into is what a lot of people in Paris and observers abroad feared, which is that it would descend into revolutionary terror, that there would be another reign of terror.
A replay of what happened after the French Revolution back in 1789. That doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. And people had good reason for fearing that it would, because it did before. Now, there are constant outbreaks of violence during the brief life of the Paris Commune. It's really important that we not in any way, underplay that. The violence it's not quite daily, but it is constant, and there are many clashes. But the Commune doesn't engage in any of the practices that really shaped revolutionary terror. They don't engage in purges. They don't seize private property. They don't suspend civil liberties. So in many ways, their critics and opponents, particularly within Paris, reported that they were kind of pleasantly surprised. They were certainly relieved. The radicals didn't go as far as they feared that they would go. Now, we've mentioned a couple of times in telling this story that, of course, Karl Marx is very interested in what's going on in Paris. He's alive and well. He's just in his 50s. He's living in Soho in London. And he's following every dispatch from Paris, of course, with fascination, probably with pride. And also, we can imagine a little bit of irritation because he's not driving it. He didn't do it. And actually, he's never really supported the French version. But actually, Marx has also never supported the French branch of the International Working Men's Association, which is better known as the First International. So the International, of course, as the name suggests, is an international alliance. It's a kind of loose alliance of socialists and trade unionists and anarchists, various radicals across different countries. But what they believe is that the working class everywhere is fighting the same battle and that they're just fighting it on different fronts. So that's the kind of principle of the International. But interestingly, Marx has never supported the French International. He doesn't really like the French branch. He called them ragamuffins, and he said half or two-thirds of them were bullies, which isn't actually wrong. And the French movement's sudden success actually caught Marx off guard. There were rumors at the time, of course, that Marx was behind it, that he was pulling the strings, that this was all a plot.
Well, it doesn't fit with his theory because France was not industrialized enough. He thought a revolution was far more likely to take place in Britain, where there was a much more concentrated, much with a stronger sense of identity, a working class that saw themselves as a working class.
And he's a little bit slow to adjust his theory to fit the facts. He's resistant, rather. But he does quickly recognize the symbolic power of the Commune. So he sends emissaries. He's not going to go himself, but he sends some people, including a beautiful young Russian Marxist named Elizabeth Dmitriev. She's just 20 years old, and she had left Russia and come to Marx to kind of, study with the great man. And he says to her, go to Paris. So she arrives in Paris with a letter of introduction from Marx, and she actually reaches the city on the day that the Commune is proclaimed, on March 28th. And within days, she's joined Louise Michel and the other women of the Paris Commune, and all of them get busy turning all of this revolutionary energy into organization. These women are really, really great organizers. 2 weeks later, Dmitriev issues her Appeal to the Women Citizens of Paris, which is a manifesto, and it calls on women to defend their city and to claim their political place in it. And then she founds a famous Union des Femmes, the Women's Union for the Defense of Paris and Care of the Wounded, which is kind of part union, part relief network, part revolutionary council, and it quickly becomes the engine that drives the Commune's social programs. So it is what organizes aid. It's what it makes sure that wages actually get where they're supposed to go. It's running workshops for displaced women. And so from London, Marx and Engels are watching as these theories are seeming to come to life, but they can't send any practical support. They can only send solidarity. But that's actually enough to help the Commune, give them that sense of larger purpose. And when it's over, Marx will write an incredibly famous account called The Civil War in France. And that's a pamphlet that helps turn the 72 days of the Paris Commune into a legend.
And guarantees its long tail, its life into the 20th century as this model, this moment when workers took control.
Now, for all of the women's activism in the Commune, it's important to say that no women actually sit on the governing council of the Commune. Their influence runs through clubs, committees, and especially through Dmitriev's Women's Union. But they're not actually leading the Commune. It's still led by men. So its feminism has a pretty clear limit. And these women are not campaigning for the vote. This is not about suffrage. In fact, they argue that universal suffrage is a bourgeois fix. They think it is a sop. They want to change society from within, and they think that just changing who gets to mark a ballot isn't going to do it. And the Commune does back them, even though it doesn't give them leadership, with the reforms that we've seen, including free education, and that it's secular and compulsory for both sexes. And of course, that principle still underpins French schooling today. But even without being given formal office to run the Commune, these women's vision is absolutely years ahead of its time, right? I mean, it's a social revolution that makes a lot of the early suffrage campaigns in Western Europe and in North America look really quite timid by comparison.
So Paris is being ruled by a radical government with ideas that are in many ways ahead of its time, but the rest of France is being ruled by the national government based in the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris. But there are other places in France, looking at what's happening in Paris, where the radicals and the working class take inspiration and begin to set up communes of their own of sorts.
And they do, and they're in some cases places with large working class populations of their own, places like Marseille and Toulouse. And they sort of pop up in a few places, Saint-Étienne. And that gives hope, of course, to the Commune in Paris because they're very much on their own. That's what this whole story has been, is Paris on its own against the rest of the country and against Prussia. and it needs allies. And so they see these signs of hope, but none of those communes last very long. Some are quashed, some just kind of lose traction, they fizzle out. So the Paris Commune is increasingly isolated. And as we've said before, most of the rural areas of France are decidedly out of sympathy with what is happening in Paris. And the Commune is also feeling the loss of its own potential leader, Auguste Blanqui, who is still locked up in the south of France in Figeac. And what happens is, realizing that they really need Blanqui, which they realized pretty early on, a few communards take the decision to try to get Blanqui, and they think that if they can effect an exchange, they might be able to convince Thiers to release Blanqui.
A prisoner exchange.
So they take several hostages. One of them is the Archbishop of Paris, Georges Darbois, and they offer to exchange them for Blanqui. But Thiers, he knows that if Blanqui walks free, Blanqui is a legend, right? If he walks free, half of France's radicals are going to rally overnight, and they're all going to follow him to the barricades. So Thiers just flatly refuses. And so the Commune is now holding the Archbishop of Paris hostage, and they kind of don't have any leverage. So they just keep him in prison, and he just languishes there. Thiers says that letting Blanqui return would be the equivalent of a force equal to an army corps. So basically, it's like creating a whole nother army if you let Blanqui out. And instead, Thiers turns this hostage crisis into propaganda. And he tells the rest of the country that this is proof that the Commune is lawless. They are seizing the Archbishop of Paris and throwing him into jail.
There's a lot of effort put into propaganda at this moment of presenting the Commune not just as radical and as disorganized, as dangerous, but as unpatriotic, as being un-French. I mean, they highlight how many people high up in the Commune are not French, that there are Hungarians, there are Russians. They make a big effort to suggest that this is not really representative of France, and look at this government, it is full of outsiders.
And that plays into the kind of conspiracy theories as well, that Marx is behind all of this. So this is, and we'll see this again in the Russian Revolution, we'll see it in the Red Scares that play out after that, this sense that there's a conspiracy and the Marxists are infiltrating the government, but this is not really a French movement.
Yeah. But this propaganda plays on divisions that are very deep and already there in France between the far more conservative, far more Catholic rural areas and radical Paris.
Yeah. Because as we've been saying, the rural France has its view of Paris, but we haven't yet talked about Paris's view of rural France. And they often, we're making vast generalizations here about a city of 2 million people, right? But a lot of Paris will talk about rural France as a kind of shorthand for backwardness, right? So they're saying that peasants are voting against their own interests and only the intellectuals and theorists of Paris ought to be running things.
And this is a big debate within what's becoming socialism in the 19th century, whether, the phrase that's often used is whether the peasants have revolutionary potential, whether people who have this commitment to their own land, i.e. their own property, could ever truly be radical. And there's a debate between Marx and the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin at this point about whether the peasants can be radical.
And indeed, that many of them argue that on that basis, that universal suffrage is a bad idea even for the revolution, because they argue that universal suffrage would just let peasants vote against their own interests. So the argument that they're not capable of looking after their own interests. So it's the same city versus country divide that still defines modern politics in so many countries, and each side saying that the other side misrepresents the country, that you are not a true version of the country.
You're not really the people.
You're un-French or un-American or un-British, that you're, misrepresenting the nation's soul on some level. So the Paris Commune is just an early explosive version of that same tension, the urban metropolitan populace divided against a hostile countryside. And meanwhile, while all of this is happening, while all of these arguments are happening, down the road in Versailles, Thiers has been rebuilding his forces.
The forces of the official French government.
Yeah. And so the dream of this self-governing leftist radical Paris is about to meet a very brute reality.
At this point, the Commune only has weeks to live. And the death of the Commune comes very, very violently. In one of the most violent weeks in the whole history of Paris, an outbreak of killing, of bloodletting by both sides that is still remembered and is still deeply controversial and deeply divisive in Paris even today.
So join us next time as the barricades go up at last and the Commune meets its reckoning.
Thank you for listening.
See you then.